like to me in my mind, because we're made through Christ
Mm-hmm.
and he obligated himself to us, it's part of our being. It's part of
Yeah.
our DNA to be at least connected to one another. I don't feel like we can escape the connection that we have as humans.
Right. We'll always be linked.
Yeah, like we're always linked because we're made of the same stuff, even though we're unique expressions of the stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We're still linked, and we're still like at a foundational level made of the same stuff. So
It makes me think about marriage. Like,
mm-hmm.
that's just the easiest example. Like, we are voluntarily using our free will to commit our life to live with someone else. That means like pooling finances, pooling sometimes kids, pooling decision making, cars, houses, dishes, everything down to like your vacuum and pets. Like, it means combining all these things and obligating, committing them together. And so in a sense there's a duty of care, like especially for like someone marrying into a family already like with kids or like having stepkids. You have the obligation to care for that other family. I mean, you can choose not to, but like that person probably wouldn't be living out of a place of love. Like, screw your kids, I'm gonna go do my own thing. Like, if they just didn't care at all. That being said, like, there's such a thing called like healthy boundaries. That doesn't mean you're like, doing things you shouldn't do. But um yeah, I think there's a lot of commitment, but I wonder if I'm saying commitment over obligation, because I feel like commitment is a willing and loving obligation almost. When I think of obligation, I think of like growing up, I was obligated to do my chores. I was obligated to do my schoolwork. Like, those are things I had to do that I didn't want to do. It wasn't a willing, like, let me sign up for homework today. Like, didn't feel like doing that, but like, I did want to graduate. I did want to play outside after school, and like, school would never end if I never did it. So, like, as a kid, those are kind of the things you have to go through.
Can you did we pull up the definition for obligation or just duty?
I don't think I've read either of them, but I have both.
You have obligation?
Mm-hmm. Obligation is an act or course of action to which a person is morally or legally bound, a duty or commitment.
So morally or legally bound.
I like that, morally bound, because there's no law that's like, we don't have like a moral law. Like, we do in the sense of like, don't murder someone, but that's also legal. So like, you know. But I feel like moral codes and laws are more of a personal definition rather than defined for us. To an extent.
Really? Because like aren't morals, I mean, you can have like personal morals, but like this kind of gets into like what's that called? Apologetics, where it's like, God sets the standard. It's by God's standard that morality exists, not our own standard. Because if humans made the standard, there would be no standard because we would all have different standards.
I mean, the first moral code that is written in our Bible is like the Ten Commandments. And that was a partnership between God and Moses. So I guess in my mind, a moral code can be created through God and man. Like, it's a coexistent code written together, because like, it applies to humans, but God obviously cares about like how our feelings are taken care of. Like, don't covet, don't murder, don't steal. Like, there's all these things that are kind of like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But on like a personal level, I feel like we morally get to decide, like, when I marry somebody, these are the things I'm obligated to do as a wife, because I think it, or a husband, whatever kind of spouse, because I do think people view it differently. Like, for me, in my marriage, I could say I'm morally obligated to cook. That's just because Chris just doesn't cook that much. And he likes it when I cook. That being said, he's morally obligated to wash the dishes because I have eczema.
No, I think that goes into morally obligated.
It's a strong term to use for it. I'm using kind of a silly example, but I think like
I think it's just like in those scenarios, it just seems like that's just what we agree on.
right.
You're not gonna cook every single night. Like
True.
he's gonna cook. We're gonna be on our own tonight. We're gonna, like you're gonna make spaghetti tonight. Like I don't know. I feel like where it comes to moral and legal, that's like there is no other choice.
Like
This
we're not
is
on our
the
own for spaghetti. This must happen every
of the
night.
land for all
Okay.
people at all times. Like so I guess I like what you said earlier about the difference between commitment and obligation. And that's where I feel like this kind of difference is. Like obligation, if it is a moral and legal law, it is like for everyone
Yeah,
all the
that's
time.
true.
But when we're just making commitments to one another,
it's more of a choice.
It doesn't hit that level.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, okay, yeah, I can go to dinner Friday night. That's fine. Like I'm committed to meeting you for dinner or whatever. But if something comes up, and I just can't make it. You know what I mean? If I get a migraine, I'm not going to dinner. I'm not legally bound in any sense. So it seems to me if we're talking about being legally bound or morally bound, that is empty of freedom.
Yeah. I have to think about that one. I haven't considered it, but it's the reason I kind of feel weird about it is because I was originally taught the idea of like full freedom was 100% submission to God. And that like in order to really be free, basically it had to be like obligated to be his servant. That's what it felt like for me. So like that's what I was told growing up, but I don't know if I'm sitting in the same place or not. But it was like
Reconstruction live with Joellen.
honestly, like, oh my gosh. Basically, if you were not in 100% trust, union, commitment, obligation, unity with the Father, you were not free. That was the understanding of the church, the family, all the things when I grew up. So for me now as an adult, I obviously view God differently and I view the church differently. And I believe that I'm in 100% union with God all the time, no matter what. But my realization of that is where I feel more free. Like, I believe I will always be made of the stuff of Christ. I believe that everybody in my life will always be made of the stuff of Christ. Whether or not they're like, oh, yeah, I am, or no, I'm not. I still believe that they are. That's like a law. Like a moral law in my mind.
Natural law.
Yeah,
like a law of nature, gravity,
like that's
those kinds of like inescapable.
Yeah, like that's just a fact.
It's just DNA.
Whether or not like you say you are or agree with that fact, that's just kind of something that I believe. But I believe that the acceptance of I'm made of the stuff of God is something that is freeing. So in that sense, yeah, it's like this because I never felt the freedom of like being obligated to God. Like,
now it's funny that you're bringing up I never felt the freedom, because this is another aspect of the conversation I had in a brief exchange on Facebook where I was asking the question like, what is it about freedom? Like, what's the big deal? Like, what's the end game in freedom? Because I know the contrast between, like you said, I had a very similar experience before in my like super traumatic religious life of it. Freedom was defined for me as those things. Like there was a cage built around me
And within that
and
cage,
I was told that within that cage is where your freedom is. And so there's this massive trauma, like, oh my gosh, it's so like on the outside looking at back at that, I'm like, oh my gosh. But it's like, it's kind of like discipline. Like with children, I at least I feel like kids crave discipline. Like they crave to know where the boundaries are.
Yeah.
They function so much more like healthily when they understand boundaries and what is, safe and what is not safe, and all those things. So in a sense, I can understand how we got to that place as a religion, how we got to the place of creating cages. We used to call it in our house the circle of safety. Like, here are the boundaries. Here's how far you can go before your dad and I can't keep you safe anymore. Once you go outside of that boundary that we're creating here, you're no longer like under our protection. We don't have the physical ability and capability to protect you.
There is definitely wisdom in that as a parent. Yeah.
Yeah. So and there's some truth to that, right? Like, and I think the same thing happened in the garden with, if we think that scene in the garden literally happened, where God said, here's the tree, here's what it consists of, I would advise you not to eat of it. Like, you're not ready for that, but you've got the choice. It was the same thing with our kids. Here's the boundary line. You're free. You're free to go across it. I can't force you to stay in it. You have to make the choice to stay in it. But be forewarned, should you go beyond it,
sorry,
consequences will come, And so, yeah, I feel like the same thing could be said. So I think that's how we got to that place in religion. Like, there is some truth to it. Like, when you understand where boundaries are, what boundaries are, there is a certain level of freedom, because we're still free to go outside the boundary. We're still free to experience the consequence. We're still free to choose whatever it is that may bring positive or negative consequence. And it's all just knowledge and information anyway, right? Like, if Adam and Eve had not eaten the apple, they would just have a certain level of understanding, and they would maybe have grown to maturity another direction, another way. But they jumped ahead. It's kind of how I see it. Yeah, like they jumped ahead into something they weren't ready for, and it created these negative consequences of like fear and doubt, and like they just weren't ready for that much information. They hadn't been on the planet but a hot second,
Yeah.
So like they were toddlers in the candy store and all the things. So
it's interesting because in their time, like, there was no Jesus on earth. There was no Jesus rose from the dead, we're saved. Like, because that was a lot of that's how it's written. And for them to have the full understanding of good and evil, because that's what it says, you will understand good and evil. For them to have that understanding and to not have the Christ figure, like, it makes me kind of realize why the Old Testament probably happened. Why their traditions were put together, because God literally probably, kind of a guess, had to create,
here's your hypothesis,
a circle of safety. Because Adam and Eve kind of jumped ahead a little bit. A lot. Suddenly understood good and evil. They're passing down that to their kids. I mean, right away, Cain was like, screw this, murdered his brother. And so now God has to kind of institute these traditions and these ideals and these boundaries in order to kind of, okay, now that you've jumped ahead a lot, let's rewind a little bit. Let's put some things in place, put some boundaries so that, I mean, you know who you are, you know where you came from, What are the basics? What's important? There's a God. Okay, so we're going to have a tabernacle wherever we go. So you never forget. Okay, this is where we started. Here we go. And just kind of creating this, I don't know, maybe kind of a
12-step program.
Yeah, kind of like a long healing process.
Yeah.
Like, once your kid gets in the candy store, they're going to go home, throw up, and not feel well for probably the whole night. And the Old Testament was a very long night for God,
A
I
very
imagine.
long night.
God had to do a lot of background work behind the scenes, lots of cold compresses. And
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like definitely the Old Testament is like, to me, when I step back, I kind of pull out of the story and stop thinking that it's about me and my evolution, but it's more about like the evolution of mankind and mankind's need to, like you say, kind of back up and maybe start over and like stumble and fall, stumble and fall, stumble and fall. Like they're the toddler, they're the baby learning how to walk, learning who God is, who their parents are, learning who, to trust in the world. And yeah, I feel like the Old Testament is more like that for me now.
yeah.
And like learning how to exercise freedom, learning what freedom really feels like. Because if we step into, and it, when you have duty and obligation and structure built around you, it feels very safe.
Yeah,
In
there's a
some
sense of
ways,
comfort.
because it's like, oh, I know what's there to catch me when I fall. Whereas if there is no duty, obligation, structure, responsibility, none of that, and it's sort of just a free for all, we can revert back to that. There is a sense in which we can revert back to that toddler in the candy store who doesn't know any better, and we just kind of do all the things. But I don't know, I feel like there's maybe a balance to be found there between, like, we are free beings, we are free to make all the mistakes that we make. We have that choice in front of us. And to me, it's through those mistakes that we're learning more and more about freedom. Like it's almost like we need the cage in some sense early on in our life. So that, because it's like light and dark, kind of goes back to, April and May. April showers bring May flowers. If we don't have the dark, we don't know what the light is. If we don't have the dark, we don't have time of stillness to contemplate and to cultivate light. But if we don't have, like, freedom and obligation are just two sides of the same coin, maybe. And so we're still coming back to the same, it's just another way perhaps of talking about light and dark. And like they need each other. Like, do I know what freedom is if I don't know what obligation is?
Yeah.
If I've never experienced obligation, will I understand fully the benefits of freedom and the ins and outs of freedom? And maybe talk a little bit more, maybe go into a little bit more depth on, if you can, about like what freedom used to look like to you, or like how did you see freedom lived out in your home?
Oh yeah, that's easy. Freedom looked like, it's gonna sound really, really weird, but being married young and being barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen your whole life. Easy as that. That was my life. And that was like, so like going through life, that's what I was raised for. That was like your purpose on the planet. Like that was the role assigned to a woman. A man was to provide, protect, and pursue his family. And the wife was to provide from the home, be pregnant, trying to use
At all times.
at all times, and to be a homemaker. And so that's what I learned how to do. And I was passionate and I loved it. And I was like, yes, this is exactly what I want. And I, like, to be honest, I still want some of those things. It's not like it's a totally disgusting idea to me now. But it was this idea of, hey, you're going to grow up, you're going to go through high school, you don't need college, it's a waste of your time, you don't need that to be a wife and mother, and you are going to grow up. As soon as you graduate, you're going to get married, you're gonna have a family, you're gonna raise kids, and that's gonna be the best feeling in the world. And I was like, great, let's do it. And so like that's what I aspired to be. And I started having problems as early as like 12 years old with that because I mean it was small little silly things, but I was like, because of how, dare I say, simple that dream was, like it's not hard to become a stay-at-home. I mean, in this like day and age, it is a little harder to have one house income, but like it's not hard to get pregnant. It's not hard to be a mom in that sense, and it's not hard to be married. It's sometimes harder to stay married if you're in a rush to get married, though. So like in this day and age, like those things are pretty easy to come by. That dream is not like I'm going to be a doctor, like put in so many years. I want to go to Harvard. Like those are really big, expensive, highly committable things. But like being a wife and mom is kind of like what most people gravitate towards. So it's not hard to crush those dreams though. When
We're gonna
like
make some people mad who are gonna think like so strong.
it is, I mean, yes, it is absolutely hard. It's just easy to become a mother.
There you go.
Yeah, it's easy to conceive and have a child. It's easy to be a mom
For
once you take on that role.
some women,
Yeah, some women are not.
barring biological difficulties.
Yes.
Like,
In
take
general,
this in the spirit that it's being presented.
yes,
I hope.
sometimes too easy. There are teenage mothers out there, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But all to say, my dream was very achievable, I thought. But once like I started, this is so dumb, but like as soon as I started cooking in the kitchen, like my mom was like, here, help me with these things. And I'd help her with food and it was great. And then as soon as it was my turn to cook, everything I made took twice the time and it was like the most discouraging thing in the world. Like to me, that was my life dream. Everyone's like, I can cook. I'm like, no. As that being your life dream to just know how to like cook and raise a family, I was failing already. And I was like, I can't do this anymore. Yeah, it's terrible. And then the next thing happened, I graduated.
Like a feeling like you're when you're that age and you're that young and you think that your destiny, your purpose in life, your duty to yourself, your family, your God is to be a wife, mother, a good cook, like all those things, and you're already failing at that young age. Like I can imagine the sense of shame and
like, oh my gosh, so much guilt.
Yeah, and like the opposite of freedom happening. Yeah. Like you're all like you're starting to the walls are caving in and
suddenly that dream didn't look so fun anymore. And the next thing kind of happened when I turned 16 because I actually graduated at 16 and graduated early. And suddenly I realized I was like, oh, my parents will never let me get married this young. That's not.
So now what?
Yeah, and it's not super legal. And to be honest, no one was in sight at the moment. And so I was like, oh, what now?
Yeah.
Can't go to college. And it's not like I could never. It was just like, why would I ever? It's a waste of my time. That's just kind of what I was taught. And so I immediately, I mean, I was already working full time and I just continued. I just dove into my work. I don't really remember 16 to 18 because I just worked my little booty off. Like straight up, I don't remember what I did.
Full-time working at 16?
I worked full-time my entire senior year. I was working 35 hours a week and doing school. And yeah, so I've worked full-time for, I mean, 6 years now, probably. And like that's, I don't remember what I did.
Okay, for our listeners, she's only 21.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like I don't really remember what life was like. I just remember like not knowing what's next. There was no next. No one was asking to date me. No one was like talking to me about like what I was gonna do next. I mean, I was still trying to cook.
Yeah, still
like my dreams were like fading really quickly, and I was like, maybe this isn't it. What do I do? Like, I don't have a new dream. What's next? And so I ended up, well, I mean, family issues began to kind of emerge, and I was like, oh, okay, may not be so fun to stay living at home by myself because all my sisters were married, so like I was the child. I was like, this isn't so fun anymore. I'm an adult, my dream is fading, family issues are arising, I'm moving out. And I did very quickly. Sorry, mom and dad. So I move out, and I was like, all right, time to find freedom.
So you're starting to now deconstruct your childhood sense of freedom and like figure out what is freedom really.
And that's when everything started that I talked about in the darkness episodes.
Yeah. So go back and listen to that if you want to hear
that's a
that
lot
whole
of
story.
fun.
We won't rehash it today.
Yep. Went through a lot of things that were not very freeing. A few of them were like, it was good for me to find my boundaries, but it wasn't like I found my new dream or anything. It was like, oh, this is not freeing at all.
Yeah.
This is not what I hoped it to be. So yeah, overall freedom was just kind of this big ambiguous idea of like, I'll become a stay-at-home wife and mom. And then it became quickly like, I have no idea, just try everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say now though, it's kind of evolved into this mindset. Rather than me waiting on, and this is something I'm learning in the moment as I've had like a rough week and I'm like feeling empty, rather than just relying on external things to be freeing. I mean, I have a full life, very full, and none of it is quite exactly what I want to be doing with all my time. Like, I'm doing kind of the things I want to, just not in the ratios of time that I desire to. And so I'm working towards my dream of like what I feel like I want to accomplish, with the headspace of I'm living in abundance. God has a plan. God's with me in this plan. He's with me through this life space of like,
Yeah.
And through that, like, I have the choice to live how I want. I have the choice to do so many things in my life. So I guess I would put it as more of a mindset, and a heart and head space kind of together of like, I can do whatever I want. And to have the means to do that is crazy. Like, that's a huge blessing. Not everybody has the means to do what they want. But like, we had the means to go to Walmart and buy Chris a bike the other day, and I already have a bike, so we can go biking together. Like, that's freeing. I love riding my bike. So like, there's small moments of freedom, and there's even just bigger ones of, I think, being in union with spirit. I think I talked about it a little bit already, but rather than having this idea of freedom as being obligated to God, it's the idea of just having the realization that I am already part of God, which is cool.
So cool.
Yeah.
I love how, like, I know there are some cool proverbs that say knowledge is the beginning of wisdom, like, or is it? Yeah, I think that's what it says.
Yeah, no, yeah, you're right.
So, yeah, I feel like I love how the more we learn, the more we kind of get, I don't know, for me, it's like it kind of starts in the head. You know, like I pick up understanding, I pick up knowledge, I pick up like, wait, that doesn't make any sense. You know, like as I'm kind of tearing down toxic religion and the things that I was taught there, and like wrestling with it for a while and then rebuilding something new and like working together with spirit to kind of like understand better and know more, and like there's freedom in that whole process. Do you feel like as you are sort of and reconstructing your religious beliefs, where do you feel like your new experience of freedom is coming from? Do you still feel like it's coming from like your current religious belief or journey, or like how are you redefining freedom now? Because I imagine that you can't unlearn everything all at once, right? It's like an onion, you know, trauma is like an onion. When you peel back one or two layers, it's like, okay, cool, I'm going to live in that for a while. And then later on down the line, something else comes up and then you peel back another 1 or 2 layers and you're like, okay, I'm going to live in that for a while. Like, so it's just this journey that goes on and on and on. So like, how is your relationship to freedom being defined on this new sort of religious redefinition,
Yeah.
rejourneying?
I mean, I would say the deconstruction and the reconstruction is the freedom to an extent. Like, because I'm looking into what could be. I mean, there's freedom for me just in asking.
Oh, yeah.
Just being able to ask the question and not feel immediately like God's like, really? That's a dumb question. Like,
That's a dumb one.
just to, yeah. Just to,
There's no judgment.
yeah, there's no judgment. And so even just learning that God isn't judging my question, learning, I would say it's the learning that is providing the freedom. And opening freedom into many other pockets of my life. Like, now I know that I can still live my dream and I can still be a stay-at-home mom, but I can also be more. And I can go to college if I want, even if I never use that degree in a professional sense. I could go get a degree in nutrition and just know how to treat my family, like treat my family's bodies better. Like, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And that's freeing, because living in a day and age where all information is available all the time, I can live in a space where I can just ask about information and I don't have to know the right answer. That's freeing. Oh my gosh. Not having to be right all the time. I'm like, oh, this is relaxing.
Yes.
I don't have to have a full defense ready. Like, being married to a healthy person is freeing, because that's great, because I can do these explorative things and ask the explorative questions, and I don't have to talk to him about it and be like, well, why do you think that? Instead it's, oh, why do you think that? Yeah, it's, oh, what makes you come to that conclusion? Let's talk about it. It's curiosity rather than like So I think it's the deconstruction from judgment to curiosity that's really shaped how I view it. If that makes
Thanks for joining us on the Becoming Home podcast, where we're talking about freedom here in July. Don't forget, you can run over to buymeacoffee.com/the Becoming Home podcast to buy us a coffee. Hey, come back next week for week 3, where we're going to be talking about eternal conscious torment and what that means for our freedom. Or do we have freedom if the only alternative is hell? Let's talk about it. Come back next week.